Our modern lesson comes from Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Published in 1915, it is one of the Czech author's best-known novels. Best-known works, period. It tells the story of Gregor Samsa, a traveling textile salesman who awakes to find that he has been transformed into a human cockroach. Our reading is the opening of that story, which lets the reader know immediately that they have entered the realm of the absurd, only to find a story all too real for anyone who has ever experienced a sudden change of circumstances. One morning, when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armor-like back, and as he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. His bedding was hardly able to cover it and seemed ready to slide off in any moment. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, waved about helplessly as he looked. What happened to me, he thought. It wasn't a dream.
Our ancient lesson this morning comes from the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus suddenly appears to sparkle and glisten on the mountain with 3 of his disciples. They are amazed as Jesus' more than human characteristics are on full display. We call this the story, the Transfiguration, but the Greek word is metamorphosis. I told you I'd mess up on that. The same word used to describe a change of form, such as a tadpole to a frog or a caterpillar to a butterfly. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became bright as light. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with them. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, is it good for us to be here? If you wish, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, and they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead."
Just want to make sure I can see everybody on Zoom. Got it, here we are. So, as you know, we're worshiping as 2 congregations today. One identifies as an explicitly Christian congregation, and the other is Unitarian Universalist. So often when I'm thinking about how to prepare and choose texts and whatnot, I tend to stray away from some of the more supernatural stuff. I tend to look for the stuff that feels like it connects with all of us. And I will say the transfiguration of Jesus Christ was not the most obvious. It's one of the more sort of miraculous stories that we read in the gospel. But as I sat with it and thought about it, I realized that at the core of this story, this account that Matthew gives us, is a really, really simple thing to understand. It's that propensity, that ability to be transformed or transfigured or changed significantly. Would you please be with me in prayer? Holy One, you call us all into creation. You continually call us to be transformed in community, to encounter one another, to bear witness to one another, to share in one another's joys and sadnesses. Send your Spirit among us this day. Open our hearts to the radical transformation you have in store for us in this place. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be holy and right. Amen. In the gospel reading this morning, Jesus is transfigured before the eyes of Peter and James and John, his disciples. He suddenly goes from being regular old Jesus to made out of light, neon sparkling Jesus in an instant. The story recalls the experience of Moses when Moses is transfigured and his face starts to glow and he comes down the mountain, and the scripture says it looked like he had horns coming out of his head. It's a really, really strange image, and it happens in an instant. That's how it seemed to Peter and James and John. 1 minute they're there with Jesus, and the next minute this being made of pure light stands before them. Jesus seems unfazed by the whole thing. Jesus doesn't seem confused or dismayed at all. He still seems like he's Jesus, Mary and Joseph's boy, the same Jesus who had hiked up the mountain with them. But the disciples experience a total transformation, a metamorphosis. As we said over and over, that's the word that the Greek uses. I never made that connection with this text until this year when I got curious and I said, I wonder what that word transfiguration is in Greek. And sure enough, my suspicion was confirmed. It is that word metamorphosis. Tadpoles become frogs, caterpillars become butterflies, and Jesus becomes something else. There are many examples of creatures that undergo partial or total metamorphosis. There's no specific definition of what metamorphosis is, but you pretty much know it when you see it. Of course, if we look at ourselves, human beings don't technically go through metamorphosis, but I know that for myself, I stand before you as a completely different life form than the Bob Feeny that wandered the halls of my high school. I'm still the same person. You can see the logical progression from one stage to the next. That's where growth and metamorphosis are not exactly the same thing. A metamorphosis is something that makes you stop and look and say, wait a minute, that came from that? Now, sometimes metamorphoses are more gradual and observable. If you find your way to a vernal pond, those really shallow ponds that pop up in the spring, you will see tadpoles at various stages. Some of them don't look like they're going to become frogs. You wouldn't believe that that's what they are if you didn't know it, but they do get to a point once they've started to sprout legs and their jaws have started to be defined, where you start to look at them and say, oh, yes, that looks a little froggy. Now, I don't think much about the inner lives of caterpillars or frogs, but they must know who they are, right? I mean, I can't imagine that a butterfly pops out of that cocoon and suddenly has no idea who it is. They must know that they were a caterpillar and that the plan was always to bundle up and morph into a butterfly. I have to think they know that. I mean, it really makes you wonder why we call caterpillars caterpillars and butterflies butterflies. Aren't they both of those things? Why the two different words? Our language reveals that we often name and identify things based on how they appear to us rather than how they relate to us. Our experience of things, of people, of creatures is based on the form in which they present themselves to us. In Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa, a traveling salesman, awakens to find that he's been turned into a horrifying insect. Instantly, his family is appalled. Gregor still knows who he is, but his family can't see it. His employer abandons him. His family locks him in his room. They ignore him, and though his sister continues to care for him by sneaking him food, he's ultimately neglected. He dies. We often think of metamorphosis as something turning into something more beautiful. And Jesus suddenly appears to his disciples to be something more than a teacher. A butterfly is somehow something more than a caterpillar. But Kafka's strange tale upends this, opting instead to show someone who is suddenly reduced from a well-respected human being to a hated creature. Gregor is still keenly aware of who he is. At first, he cannot understand that his family cannot hear him speaking, asking them to open the door to his room. They only hear bug noises, high-pitched shrieks. I think in our own ways, we all experience metamorphoses throughout our lives at various times. Sometimes they're like the butterfly, when we see someone we haven't seen in decades, and suddenly their image of who we are undergoes a complete transformation. Sometimes the metamorphoses we go through are more like the tadpole to the frog, as we grow gradually over time, taking on new things, leaving behind the things that don't really serve us. And then we only really notice how much we've changed when we stop and look back and reflect on the journey we've taken. What's really interesting is that these changes are truly in the eye of the beholder. It is the person observing the one changing that experiences the metamorphosis. No matter what happens, we still feel like ourselves. We still are ourselves. There's a thread that holds it all together. But how people perceive us, how others relate to us, can change radically and suddenly. I can't count how many stories I've heard of people who have come out, particularly in religious communities, either as gay or trans or bi, and experience something of a metamorphosis in their faith community, in the eyes of that community. Suddenly, those around them don't recognize them as the person they know them to be. Some of you have probably experienced that. Most of us have probably had an experience that is somewhat relatable to that, where someone suddenly changes their perception of you, whether it's because of something they learn about you or something you experience. It can be really disorienting, because even though we know who we are, even though we're the one that maintains that thread that holds it all together, I do believe we count on other people to help us know who we are, to confirm what we believe to be true about ourselves. I like to think I'm a pretty good person, but if enough people start telling me that I'm actually not a good person, it's not long before I'd have to start to believe it. I'd start to wonder if maybe I hadn't been wrong all the time about myself. See, even though our identities are our own, even though we get to define who we are regardless of what other people think, at the end of the day, we really do depend on one another for our own self-understanding. We only know ourselves fully in community. I would go so far as to say that we are multiple selves, that each one of us holds a multitude of selves. Different communities, different relationships bring out different aspects of ourselves. The task of living a faithful life is to somehow find a way to maintain our balance amongst these selves. How do I remain a partner, a brother, a friend, a pastor, a climber, a soccer fan, all in balance? Because if any one of those were to take over my entire life, I'm at risk of being thrown off balance. My very identity, who I know myself to be, starts to fall apart. That's the risk of a metamorphosis. That's the danger of a transfiguration. It's so easy to forget the caterpillar, to act as if the butterfly is all that matters because that's the final, beautiful, charismatic form. But really, these are both the same creature. Just like Gregor, even when he is transformed into a cockroach, is still Gregor, a son and a friend who is being treated as a vermin, just as Jesus, when he is transfigured into this being of light, is still a brother, a son, a friend, a teacher. It's tempting to attach ourselves to one version of a person, to insist that that is, in fact, who they are, to define them in some kind of a stable role. That's what we do when someone cuts us off in traffic and we call them a jerk, or worse. We've taken the person who cuts us off. We've taken that to be who they are, when it is likely just one version of that person. We don't know what version we're getting. Maybe it's the nerves frayed from dealing with two teenagers this morning version. Maybe it's the underpaid, got called into work on my day off version. They're still responsible for what they do. It might not be the kind of all-encompassing expression of their personality, of who they are, that we might assume it is in that moment. Anytime we lock someone into one form or another, we create a broken relationship, I think. Whether it's the person in traffic, our siblings and our parents, a friend or a partner, once we decide that they have assumed their permanent form, we stop seeing the fact that they are in process. We are all in process. Some of us feel like we have a long way to go. Some of us probably feel pretty settled into who we think we are, but we are all still in flux so long as we are alive and in relationship to one another and to creation. We're still learning, growing, shape-shifting, metamorphosizing. Jesus' disciples want to freeze frame him in that dazzling form that they see on the mountain. They feel validated for following this guy. Clearly, this is a prophet among prophets. They want to tell everybody who told them not to follow this guy, ha, we told you so. Moses, Elijah, Jesus, these are some heavy hitters. Why wouldn't they want to stay up there on that mountain with that version of Jesus? That dazzling light reflects well on them too. It lets them know that they are not as foolish as some of their friends probably said they were. But Jesus tells them to get up. He doesn't let them build dwelling places to stay there basking in that light. Jesus does not allow himself to be cast into that one role. Jesus comes back down the mountain to continue morphing, shifting, to be a teacher and a son and a friend and a brother, to be all of those things in extraordinary relationship to other people, touching outcasts, welcoming strangers, being transformed by their stories. Jesus will not allow the disciples to stay up there safely on the mountain, basking in this glorious vision that they've seen, assuring themselves that they're right. As a Christian, I feel called to follow Jesus back down the mountain. I like that transfigured vision of Jesus, that one made of complete light. That's a really wonderful thing. It gets me into this feeling of, yes, I chose correctly. I feel good about this and my career path. But I think that being called to follow Jesus is really about committing ourselves to relating to one another, to the world, to being open to the fact that there are multiple ways of being for human beings, that there are multiple ways of being even for me as an individual. This Wednesday, Christians will begin the season of Lent, the season leading up to Easter. During that period, we hear the story, we tell the story over and over again of Jesus undergoing transformation after transformation. From a son to a teacher to a prophet to a criminal and an enemy of the state. All of these labels that try to define him, try to put a box around him and say who he is once and for all. And of course, we know that beyond Easter, Christian theologians will continue that process for the next 2,023 years, trying to convince everybody that Jesus is exactly who they say he is. The Transfiguration and Jesus' journey back down the mountain reminds us that we are all in process, that we all undergo metamorphosis over and over and over again. We are constantly at risk of being locked into one role, but we are also constantly in the process of breaking out of those roles, of becoming more robust, more dynamic versions of ourselves. We are always something more than what we experience. We contain multitudes. That's a tougher thing to put into practice than it is to believe and grasp intellectually. We are more than what we perceive, as are others. Simple enough to hear, but really, really hard to live every day. Many Buddhists believe that all sentient beings are on their way to enlightenment, to becoming Buddhas themselves. Putting that into practice means treating each being with care and compassion, understanding that we are nurturing little Buddhas, even when they are cutting us off in traffic. The caterpillar, the butterfly, the Buddha, the Jesus, the tadpole, all of these parts of ourselves need nurturing, need care. They need to be witnessed. They need to be witnessed if we're to be whole, if we're to be ourselves in our fullness. To commit to being in relation to one another and to creation is to commit to keep looking for the multiple selves in ourselves and in all things. It's to accept that who we are is never finally settled, that we always remain in process so long as we are alive. To open ourselves to that reality is to open ourselves to curiosity, to mystery, to grace, to the possibility of miraculous things. And I believe that it is to see the world in all its dynamism, in all its possibility and wonder as it truly is. May we live each day as such. Amen.